Welcome to Marx 613. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to the seminar Marx 613 on Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party from 1848 and Lenin's April Theses from 1917 in conversation with three brilliant critical thinkers, Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser, and their book, Feminism for the 99%, a Manifesto. What we know today as the Communist Manifesto is a document that was commissioned by the Communist League at its first Congress, held in London in June 1847, written by Marx and Engels between November 1847 and January 1848, and printed in London, anonymously, in German, in late February 1848 under the title Manifesto of the Communist Party. The manifesto was intended to be the platform and program of the newly formed Communist League, successor to the League of the Just, founded a little more than a decade earlier by German emigrés in Paris. Its mission was to set forth the principles and beliefs of the Communist League. In draft form, written by Engels, it was a confession of faith, or a credo, in question and answer form. Marx and Engels transformed the draft credo and turned it into a manifesto. When first printed, it was only 23 pages long. Few documents have had such a world historic impact. In this seminar, Marx 613, we will read and discuss the Communist Manifesto in conversation with another short pamphlet that both interpreted it and put it into practice, namely Lenin's April Theses, which he delivered to Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in April 1917, at the time of his return to Russia right after the February Revolution. Lenin argued on the foundation of the manifesto for a passage from, in his words, the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants. Lenin's interpretation of the manifesto, similarly, had deep historical repercussions. Now, to study these two works in conversations, we're privileged to have with us three brilliant critical philosophers, Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser, today, who are themselves the authors of another remarkable manifesto titled Feminism for the 99%, a Manifesto, published by Verso in 2019. Cinzia Arruzza joins us from Boston University, where she's the Maria Stata Professor of Classical Greek Studies and Professor of Philosophy. Tithi Bhattacharya is a Professor of South Asian History at Purdue University. And Nancy Fraser is the Henry A. and Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. And her newest book is Cannibal Capitalism, How Our Society is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It, published with Verso in 2022. Now, their co-authored manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, operates both as a critique of certain strands of Marxism for neglecting social reproduction and the diversity of experiences within the working class, but it also builds on Marx's writings to propose a more comprehensive class struggle that includes movements against gender domination, racial capitalism, and LGBTQ oppression. Their manifesto links our current crises of gender violence, climate change, and racism, and traces them all back directly to capitalism. They advocate for an internationalist, eco-socialist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist feminism, rejecting liberal feminism and market-based solutions. Their work together, the three of them, grows out of and also militates for the international strikes that women throughout the world engaged in, particularly back in 2017 and 2018. Their manifesto emphasizes unity with other anti-capitalist movements for a broad-based global insurgency. In this full-length introduction, I'll provide some background on the three texts that we will be discussing at Marx 6:13, and sketch the outline of an argument that I'm beginning to formulate on the question of class struggle. Let me begin then with the history of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. The Communist League was officially formed in London on June 1, 1847, as the immediate outgrowth of a workers' association called the League of the Just. That association had been founded by German emigrés a decade earlier in Paris in 1836 as a Christian communist association of artisan workers. As a Christian organization, it had a strong religious conviction in neighborly love, which was reflected in its motto, "All men are brothers." It developed corresponding communities in England, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland, and as of 1846, its leaders, Joseph Moll, Karl Schapper, and Heinrich Bauer, all resided in London. Those leaders, who would become the central authority of the Communist League, invited Marx and Engels to join as members of the League of the Just in January 1847 to help shape the vision of the organization. Now, Marx and Engels had been hoping to give direction to an internationalist workers' association. They had founded the Communist Correspondence Committee in Brussels a year earlier, in 1846, with the aim of forming a revolutionary workers' party. Marx and Engels agreed to join the League of the Just, believing that they could give it direction. At their instigation, the League of the Just took on the name the Communist League on June 1, 1847. Engels participated in the first Congress of the newly formed Communist League in London from June 2nd to the 9th, 1847, while Marx remained in Brussels. At that first Congress, the League replaced its motto with a new one, "Working men of all countries, unite." They also discussed a program for the party, what was called the Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith. Of course, notice the religious tone of the document, right? Confession of faith. The draft, which was actually discovered for the first time in 1968 in archives in Hamburg, was written by Engels, and it apparently had been discussed and approved at the first Congress, and so it had been completed by June 9th, 1847. A few words about that draft of a Communist Confession of Faith from June 9, 1847. Engels drafted the credo in question and answer form. It contained important foundations for the Communist Manifesto, including, first, a crisp definition of the proletariat as distinct from working classes in general. Engels' Confession of Faith recognizes that there were workers and working classes before the advent of machine industrialization. But Engels argues that previously, worker artisans owned their tools and thus possessed forms of private property. The proletariat, by contrast, begins to exist when the workers no longer have any tools of their own, are forced to work at machines owned by capitalists, and become entirely dependent on capitalist forms of competition. The proletariat differs from early middle-class workers who, although most often poor as well, owned and used their tools and were self-sufficient and independent. Moreover, the proletariat differs from enslaved people because the latter are sold once and for all, those are Engels' words, to an enslaver who has an interest in their subsistence, whereas the proletarian workers have to sell themselves, quote, by the day and by the hour, and can be left to die if there is no need for their labor. As for the serfs, they have the use of land, which guarantees them a form of subsistence. And that's the sense in which the proletariat begin to exist only in the context of industrialization. A second point is a real historical sensibility. Engels' draft credo maintains that communism and the community of property could not exist before the advent of industrialization, and thus before the 19th century. Communism could not come into existence before there was a proletarian class that had no property. And by the same token, it could not come into existence before the advent of industrial machinery, like the steam engine, the power loom, spinning machines, that could make it possible for everyone to subsist in society. So communism, Engels wrote, and these are his words, was not possible for the slaves, the serfs, or the handicraftsmen, but only for the proletarians, and hence it belongs of necessity to the 19th century and was not possible in any earlier period. Third, the draft credo has a simple ambition and a simple demand. The Confession of Faith prefigures the famous formulation of Marx from the Critique of the Gotha program in 1875. Of course, you're familiar with that, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Here, the credo has a simple statement of the aims of communism, which is, namely, to transform society so that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom. The credo also formulates a simple demand, namely the abolition of private property. In response to the question of how communists intend to achieve their ambition, the credo states, by the elimination of private property and its replacement by community of property. Fourth, the credo expresses an openness to revolution. Now, the League of the Just, you will recall, was a Christian association and believed in neighborly love. It did not embrace violence or revolutionary struggle. Engels' draft Confession of Faith explicitly opposes conspiracies as counterproductive. And while it certainly does not call for violent revolution, it recognizes that the proletariat may be led to engage in violence, and it doesn't condemn that. It places responsibility for any revolution at the feet of the counter-revolutionary propertied classes. And it concludes with these words, if, in the end, the oppressed proletariat is thus driven into a revolution, then we will defend the cause of the proletariat just as well by our deeds as now by our words. And in that sense, it moves gradually towards a certain openness to revolutionary violence. There's also an interesting passage in the draft credo about women, and this relates to the other manifesto we're going to be studying at the seminar, Feminism for the 99%. Towards the end of the credo, Engels writes, Question 20. Will not the introduction of community of property be accompanied by the proclamation of the community of women? Answer. By no means. We will only interfere in the personal relationship between men and women, or with the family in general, to the extent that the maintenance of the existing institution would disturb the new social order. Besides, we are well aware that the family relationship has been modified in the course of history by the property relationships and by periods of development, and that consequently the ending of private property will also have a most important influence on it. Now, this passage seems to suggest that women would remain the property of their husbands, which would have been the case under principles of coverture operating at the time. It does not appear to disturb existing legal arrangements, but buys into the concept of a personal sphere that is largely autonomous of the political sphere. It intimates that the abolition of private property might modify the family relationship, but only in an unspecified way. We'll come back to that. Now, following the discussion of the first draft credo and of a set of governing rules at the first Congress of the Communist League, which ended on June 9th, 1847, the draft was circulated among the different communities in different countries for further discussion, with an eye to approving a platform and program at a second conference. In late October 1847, Engels began drafting a second version of the credo, which is known today as the Principles of Communism. Engels had been directed to draft the revised version by the leaders of the Paris Circle of the Communist League after a contentious committee meeting held on October 22, 1847. Engels drafted it, like the first, in the form of a catechism, in question and answer form. The Principles of Communism rehearse several of the same questions and answers from the first draft credo, but it is more than 3 times longer and far more detailed in parts. Engels spells out in 12 numbered bullet points the main measures that would be undertaken to achieve communism, including progressive taxation, heavy inheritance taxes, expropriation and confiscation of property, centralized credit, national workshops, nationalized education, and nationalized transportation, among other things. These measures would be taken up again in the Communist Manifesto. Engels also takes up the critique of socialists, dividing them into 3 categories that resemble the 3 categories of socialists in Part 3 of the Communist Manifesto: the reactionary, the bourgeois, and the democratic socialists. This too will be taken and developed in the manifesto. And Engels also has a section that effectively becomes the final part of the manifesto, Part 4, on positions of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. In the Principles to Communism, Engels develops a subsistence theory of wages. Like other commodities, whose value is set using a labor theory of value, Engels anchors labor to the cost of producing labor, which, he writes, consists of precisely the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to enable the worker to continue working and to prevent the working class from dying out. This produces a race to the bottom for the worker, and, as Engels writes, quote, the price of labor or the wage will, in other words, be the lowest, the minimum, required for the maintenance of life. Engels makes clear in the Principles of Communism that while industrialization harms the worker, artisans, it alone can provide the path forward to a communist future. Industrialization, productivism, is the condition of possibility for a society where, Engels writes, every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all his powers and faculties in complete freedom. Now, certain Marxists today, such as Kohei Saito, or more generally degrowth communists, critique readings of Marx that emphasize the productivism, and they propose a different late Marx who offered an eco-socialist path forward. It's precisely these kinds of passages in Engels' Principles of Communism that are at the heart of their critique. Passages like the following. It thus appears, Engels writes, that the very qualities of big industry which, in our present-day society, produce misery and crises, are those which, in a different form of society, will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. Right? He's talking about the very qualities of big industry that are both producing misery today, but are going to be essential to abolishing misery in a communist state. Now, in addition to these points, in the Principles of Communism, Engels also refines the discussion of family and women, offering a less defensive and perhaps a more kind of offensive argument against the bourgeoisie. To the question, what will be the influence of communist society on the family? Engels writes, it will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved, and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis. and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and of the children on the parents. And here is the answer, Engels continues, to the outcry of the highly moral Philistines against the community of women. Community of women is a condition which belongs entirely to bourgeois society, and which today finds its complete expression in prostitution. But prostitution is based on private property and falls with it. Thus, communist society, instead of introducing community of women, in fact, abolishes it. So you see here how he's trying to turn the whole critique of the community of women against bourgeois society, claiming that it exists through forms of prostitution, and arguing that relations between men and women will become purely private matters. Okay, again, we'll come back to that. So, after Engels drafts the Principles of Communism, which is the second draft, really, credo, he writes a letter to Marx. It's dated November 23rd and 24th, 1847, and Engels suggests that instead of drafting a catechism, they should present the program of the Communist League instead in the form of a manifesto. Engels writes, "Give a little thought to the confession of faith. I think we would do best to abandon the catechetical form and call the thing Communist Manifesto. Since a certain amount of history has to be narrated in it, the form hitherto adopted is quite unsuitable. I shall be bringing with me the one from here, which I did," he's referring to the Principles of Communism. "It is in simple narrative form, but wretchedly worded, in a tearing hurry." A week later, the Communist League meets at its second Congress, which runs from November 29 to December 8, 1847. Engels and Marx are both present and share their vision for a platform. They are assigned the task of drafting the final program in the form of a manifesto of the Communist League. Marx and Engels begin redrafting the program, this time in the form of a manifesto, immediately after the Second Congress and into the end of January 1848, when it's sent off to the presses for printing in London. These are the German Workers' Education Society's print shop. The manifesto is printed in German in late February 1848. The date is sometimes indicated as February 21, 1848, which is coincidentally the day before the revolution erupts in Paris. The manifesto is first published in German in the Deutsche Londoner Zeitung in March and July of 1848, actually when the revolution is erupting in the German states, and it would take several years for the English and French translations of the manifesto to appear in print. Okay, well, let's just say a few words about the manifesto of the Communist Party, which so much has been written about. I think for our purposes, it's important to emphasize that the manifesto builds on the two draft credos and develops several key themes. First, the manifesto recounts the birth of the proletariat as a class. It historicizes the creation of classes in relation to different economic modes of production. Second, the manifesto emphasizes the productivism of capitalism. Several passages stress how revolutionary the bourgeoisie has been, and that industrialization has revolutionized European society and made possible the advent of communism. In this way, third, it embraces a productivist horizon. One of the key goals of the proletariat, once it has gained power, is, in the words of the manifesto, to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Fourth, the manifesto emphasizes the political importance of democracy as the precondition for social change. It ties the path to communism to universal male suffrage. In its words, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. Fifth, the manifesto argues for the centralization of most functions in the state. Once the proletariat govern, Marx and Engels write, one of their first tasks will be, quote, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. The political platform includes centralizing all banking, all communication, transportation, all education in the hands of the state, and extending the state control of factories and instruments of production. Sixth, the manifesto proposes a theory of the two-stage revolution. This is clear from Marx and Engels' discussion of Germany, where they forecast in the manifesto a bourgeois revolution of a more advanced nature than the revolutions in England or France, followed by a proletarian revolution. They write, these are their words, the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In addition to these 6 points, the manifesto, of course, also continues earlier themes from the Paris and Brussels manuscripts, so from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and the German ideology. Marx and Engels reference the idea of alienation, specifically. They allude to the concept of ideology, suggesting that ideas, law, and jurisprudence are superstructural. Borrowing a page from the Brussels manuscripts, they write that, quote, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. And so you see the ways in which they pick up on these earlier themes. The question of alienation, if I can find it quickly, is discussed in one of the first sections, where you don't get as much of a clear discussion of alienation, but you do hear it, right? This is when they're talking about the machinery, the division of labor, the work of the proletarian has lost all individual character, they write, and consequently all charm for the workman. They write, he becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Right? And this doesn't use the term alienation, but it surely embroiders on that theme. Marx and Engels also discuss more explicitly the abolition of the family, and they suggest that capitalism has already abolished the family among the proletariat. Now, in all of these ways, the manifesto represents the culmination of the other works we have studied. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. It's the combination. It's the combination of the previous strands of thought in the earlier manuscripts that we studied in the seminar in the fall. It also is the culmination of Engels's draft credos, and the ultimate vision is formulated as follows. Again, anticipating the formulation in the 1875 critique of the Gotha program. What they have in mind, in their words, quote, is an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Okay, so that gives you some background on the writing of the manifesto and its contents, which of course are very well known. A short text, again, that also contains, at the end, as I mentioned earlier, a discussion and a critique of other socialist visions, and of course a placement of how they believe the Communist League should relate to other parties in other countries. And specifically, in France, they say, and this will become important in our next session on the French Revolution of 1848, in France, the communists ally themselves with the social democrats. And Engels drops a note there to explain who they're referring to. And they're referring to the party represented in Parliament by Ledru-Rollin, in literature by Louis Blanc, in the daily press by the Réforme. The name of social democracy signifies, in France, with these its inventors, a section of the Democratic or Republican Party more or less tinged with socialism. All right, that'll be important when we come back to the French Revolution of 1848 and, of course, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Okay, let me turn now then to our second text, Lenin's April Theses. Reading the manifesto through the lens of Lenin's April Theses allows us to actualize or realize the text, to put it into action, to see how it becomes a form of praxis. It might be helpful to analyze this through the lens of J.L. Austin and his writings on the performativity of words. The words of the manifesto are not performative in the same way as are the words of a judge imposing a sentence or marrying people. They do not have a direct or enforceable effect. They do not, through the speech act itself, through the utterance of the words, unite the workers or act out a proletarian revolution. But by the same token, they are not merely constative. They are not merely observational. They do not merely represent a philosophical exercise that describes reality or responds to truth conditions. They are not simply true or false. The force of the manifesto, in effect, plays an intermediary role between performative and constative. It interpolates people. Instead of creating a new legal or political relation, it moves people to action. It speaks to people in such a forceful way that they act in response. In this sense, it represents a rich illustration of the idea of interpolation that Louis Althusser deployed in his notes for ideology and ideological state apparatuses, where, as you will recall, Althusser uses the example of the police officer calling out, "Hey, you there!" I would argue that the manifesto is a far more compelling illustration of this idea of interpolation. The manifesto interpolates readers, one of whom was Lenin. Lenin's April Theses were infused with and inspired by the ideas of the manifesto. And the manifesto permeates Lenin's April Theses and the actions that Lenin would take in the following period after the Revolution of February 1917. So, for instance, Lenin's entire argument and actions were shaped by the belief that the bourgeois revolution of February 1917 was, in the words of Marx and Engels from the manifesto, but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. What Lenin proposes in his second thesis, in the April Thesis, was entirely grounded on the manifesto's theory of the two stages of revolution, bourgeois, then proletariat. Lenin writes, this is the second thesis, the specific feature of the present situation in Russia is that the country is passing from the first stage of revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants. Similarly, Lenin's call to confiscate all landed estates, that's his sixth thesis, is permeated by the manifesto's demand for the abolition of property in land and the abolition of private property. Lenin's call to nationalize banking and put all banks under the control of the Soviets, Thesis 7. Lenin's call to change the name of the party to the Communist Party in Note 3. Again, these are all infused with the manifesto. And Lenin also shares with Marx and Engels at least with the Marx and Engels from the demands in the context of Germany, the idea of arming the people. The fourth demand that Marx and Engels called for in their demands for Germany in March of 1848 is for universal, quote, universal arming of the people. In future, the armies shall be simultaneously labor armies. Similarly, Lenin calls for the abolition of the army and for, quote, the standing army to be replaced by the arming of the whole people. So the April Theses are, in the end, I would argue, a form of praxis infused with the manifesto. They are a written expression of a political strategy and practice. Lenin emphasizes in his introductory notes that, quote, I read them twice, very slowly, first at a meeting of Bolsheviks and then at a meeting of both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. He emphasizes that practiced dimension of interpolation, even the fact that he read them, in his words, very slowly. The reading itself was a political practice. Rereading the manifesto through the lens of Lenin's April Thesis allows us to see it come alive. And let me just add, one fascinating element in the April Thesis, I would say, is Lenin's call to abolish the police. That's something that I do not hear in the manifesto, which continues to disparage the lumpen proletariat. It also contradicts the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which Marx and Engels wrote, which went out of its way to exclude those convicted of crimes from the suffrage. So that's a piece of the April Theses that goes, I think, further than Marx and Engels. All right, let me turn now to our third text, Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. Feminism for the 99% is self-consciously written in the tradition of Marx and Engels. It explicitly references the Communist Manifesto in its subtitle, a manifesto. It utilizes the form of Marx's Thesis on Feuerbach in the body of the text, which is written in the form of 11 theses. And there are multiple references to Marx and Engels at the substantive level. The authors, in fact, discuss in their postface the daunting task of writing a manifesto in the shadow of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. But it's important to recognize that feminism for the 99% operates both as a critique of Marx and of certain Marxism on the one hand, and as a prolongation or extension of Marx on the other. And so, in a way, the daunting nature of the task is resolved in a way by the fact that it operates not just as a prolongation or extension of Marx, but also as a critique of Marx. Now, the critique of Marx operates at two levels. There is, first, a critique of the incompleteness of Marx's own discussion of exploitation in capital. This is the critique shared by many socialist feminists that the analysis of commodities and surplus labor in capital focuses too much on production and does not address adequately social reproduction, all of the work associated with the social reproduction of the workers, including actual reproduction, support of the family, and all of the care work that goes into reproducing laboring persons. Now, there's a second critique of certain Marxisms, insofar as certain Marxism have treated the working class as, in their words, an undifferentiated, homogeneous entity. This is a critique of the failure to understand the diversity of exploited persons and to recognize the internal differences within the working class. Building on those two critiques, Feminism for the 99% proposes an updated and more comprehensive vision of class struggle, placing class struggle in the context of other related struggles against gender oppression, domestic violence, racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, discrimination against LGBTQ persons and disabled persons. It characterizes our current form of capitalism as globalizing, financializing, and neoliberal. And it offers a diagnosis of the contemporary crises of capitalism, including not only gender oppression, but also the threat of global climate change, the regulation and constraint of sexuality, racism, colonialism, imperialism, and ethno-nationalism. It argues that these crises, which all trace back to capitalism, are linked together and reinforce each other. The truth is, they write, these are their words, that racism, imperialism, and ethno-nationalism are essential buttresses of generalized misogyny and the control over all women's bodies. In the face of these challenges, the manifesto embraces the idea of class struggles in an enlarged and updated manner. They write, "Feminism for the 99% embraces class struggle and the fight against institutional racism. It centers the concerns of working-class women of all stripes, whether racialized, migrant, or white, cis, trans, or gender nonconforming, housewives or sex workers, paid by the hour, the week, the month, or not at all, unemployed or precarious, young or old." In terms of their strategy and demands, the authors distinguish themselves from several other feminist approaches. The first is liberal feminism, that is pro-capitalist. That's an easy one. Another is the market-based approaches of offering microloans to poor women in the global south, which they refer to as the Femocrats approach. They argue that this simply increases women's dependence on their creditors. They also oppose carceral feminism and the turn to criminalization and punishment that is often advocated to address gender violence. What they argue for is an internationalist, eco-socialist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist approach that links arms with the other movements for the 99%. They oppose the simplistic opposition between identity politics and class politics, and they conclude by calling for a broad-based, global anti-capitalist insurgency. In their words, which is emphasized, italicized, "Rejecting the zero-sum framework capitalism constructs for us, feminism for the 99% aims to unite existing and future movements into a broad-based global insurgency. Armed with a vision that is at once feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist, we pledge to play a major role in shaping our future." The main thrust, then, is to join ranks with those fighting against racism and global warming, fighting for labor and migrant rights, for disability and LGBTQ rights. They eschew the idea of being a separatist movement. They propose instead, in their words, to join with every movement that fights for the 99%, whether by struggling for environmental justice, free high-quality education, generous public services, low-cost housing, labor rights, free universal health care, or a world without racism or war. It is only by allying with such movements that we gain the power and vision to dismantle the social relations and the institutions that oppress us. And elsewhere in the manifesto, the authors reiterate the importance of this. Feminism for the 99%, they say, must join forces with other anti-capitalist movements across the globe, with environmentalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and LGBTQ plus movements and labor unions. We must ally, above all, with left-wing anti-capitalist currents of those movements that also champion the 99%. Now, the manifesto is itself an outgrowth of the three authors' collaborative work on the transnational feminist strikes of 2017 and 2018, especially the 2017 women's strike, the Women's March in the United States, which they view as a new form of political action and a new kind of politics. The book, they say, is intended to be a course correction to reorient feminist struggles. It ends by embracing a certain vision of universalism, in its words, to fight against capitalism's weaponization of our differences. This question of universalization may be a topic for further discussion at the seminar. So that gives you an idea then of the three texts and how they relate to each other. Let me now turn to some personal reflection on the texts and on the ideas in the Communist Manifesto. And let me start by talking about the need to rethink the category of the proletariat. The Communist Manifesto was a radical revolutionary call to industrialized workers, to the proletariat. It had a specific historical specificity. It was tied to the historical emergence of the proletarian workers and industrialization. On its account, the proletariat had not existed before industrialization. There were working classes before, such as enslaved persons and serfs, but they were not the proletariat. Marx and Engels make this clear throughout the different versions of the credo, and including the manifesto itself. The proletariat only began to exist with the advent of industrialized machinery that displaced independent tradesmen and craftsmen. The concept of the proletariat, then, depended on the historical transformation of a certain class of artisan workers and craftsmen, who were themselves middle class. Their transformation into precarious workers entirely dependent on capitalists and capitalist competition. It rested on a sharp contrast between those two different modes of existence. On the one hand, autonomous middle-class artisans with their own tools and equipment and a livelihood, right? On the other hand, pure manual labor dependent on the needs, equipment, and capital of the industrialists. The self-consciousness of being a proletarian worker depended on having had a prior self-consciousness of being an independent artisan with some dignity. In other words, it rested on a form of alienation from a prior way of life. And that prior way of life involved mostly white, relatively entitled men and some women who had experienced forms of self-reliance and dignity because of their trades, and who subsequently experience a loss of dignity when they're stripped of their self-sufficiency and turned into dependent, supplicant, slave-like labor. As Marx and Engels write, quote, "The lower strata of the middle class, the small trades people, shopkeepers and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraft and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production." Marx and Engels write of the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. They were identifying a particular, historically situated experience of downward social mobility. And this explains why they distinguished from the proletariat the separate condition of the lumpenproletariat and of what they called the peasants, a term that is jarring today, so I'm going to use instead rural populations. Marx and Engels effectively excluded those other groups, lumpenproletariat, rural populations, from the analysis of the proletariat. In the manifesto, they suggest that the lumpenproletariat have been better prepared from their conditions of life for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue, they write. And, as I mentioned, in their demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which was written a couple of months later in March 1848, they specifically excluded from the franchise persons convicted of crimes. As for the rural populations, at this time in 1848, Marx and Engels did not view them as a revolutionary force or as a class that would bring about revolution. At best, they could be allies. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels characterized the rural populations as reactionary, is trying to roll back history to promote their old interests and to prevent their own extinction. Their standpoint is conservative. It's only when they pay heed to their future interests, realizing that they too will sink into the proletariat, that they might become revolutionary. The, quote, small peasants, and for that matter the petty bourgeoisie as well, had aligned interests with the proletariat, according to Marx and Engels. It was in their interest to have a communist revolution, but they were not the driving force. You hear this as well in demands of the Communist Party in Germany from March 1848. Those demands include the abolition of all feudal obligations and the elimination of landowners and of the propertied class. It provides for all rural mortgages to be taken over by the state and paid to the state. In effect, the goal is to get rid of landowners and feudal lords entirely and to create instead a state that will oversee banking, credit, and mortgage so that the rural workers will effectively become small landowners or borrowers. But what's plain is that the rural population, the petty bourgeoisie, at least at this time, and we'll need to keep an eye on this in the next text on the French Revolution, when we read Class Struggles in France and when we read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. But at least at this time, the rural population, the petty bourgeois, are at best fellow travelers, potential allies, who might have convergent interests and might support a socialist revolution. As Marx and Engels write in the demands, quote, it is to the interest of the German proletariat, the petty bourgeoisie, and the small peasants to support these demands with all possible energy. Only by the realization of these demands will the millions of in Germany who have hitherto been exploited by a handful of persons and whom the exploiters would like to keep in further subjection win the rights and attain to that power to which they are entitled as the producers of all wealth. But it's not clear to them at this point that the rural populations will actually back the proletariat revolution. Now, so what's clear from all of this is that Marx and Engels were writing about the condition of industrial workers in Western Europe in the mid-19th century. They were not writing about the wretched of the earth. They were not writing about colonized populations. They were not writing about rural masses in the 20th century. There's a historical and a geographical specificity to the proletariat, which means that rereading the manifesto today is somewhat jarring, right? Because there isn't the same sense that there is a proletariat today. We live in very different social conditions now. People have been de-skilled. They no longer have a trade or craft that they have lost. They are rarely taught a trade or a skill to begin with. Factory work, where it exists and persists in the West, has become a livelihood. Plus, with unionization in Western Europe and strong syndicates like the CGT or CFDT in a country like France, there start to be vested interest in being a unionized factory worker. To add on that, people live in a service and gig economy in the industrialized West. Precarious workers depend on their own property as service tools, an automobile for the Uber driver, or your arts and crafts for Etsy. Many service workers have become independent contractors, precarious, of course, autonomous in a way, at the mercy of the supposed market. In addition, the original moment of downward social mobility is not a common experience. There is today little self-consciousness of being proletarianized or of belonging to a proletarian class because there is no prior self-consciousness of having been or having the possibility of being an independent craftsman. If all one knows and expects is the possibility of being a precarious worker, if that is the only worker option, then one does not experience it as downward social mobility. Some of these changes may explain why those who fit previously in the category of the proletariat, like the working class and industrialized Western societies like the United States or France are turning increasingly to extreme right, such as Donald Trump's MAGA or Le Pen's Rassemblement National. Why, you might ask? Well, perhaps because they feel threatened, whether legitimately or not, or they are told to feel threatened by what they perceive as a lower class of immigrant persons of color from the global south, for instance, from Latin America and the US, or from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and France. And these newer immigrants may be perceived, or they're taught to be perceived as threatening because they are seen, again, rightly or wrongly, as threats to the livelihood of these former proletariat, supposedly taking their jobs, right? Threats to their safety. We've seen just waves of moral panic recently, and threats to their identity, to their language, and to their culture. As a result, Marx's analysis of classes today needs to be updated. The central challenge, though, is whether we should still focus on class struggles, even enlarged notions of class struggles that would include race, gender, and ethnicity. So let me turn, in conclusion, to that question. And let me put it under this header. Perhaps the problem is no longer class struggle, but the taste for domination. Let me explain. For the longest time, I thought that Marx and Engels were basically right. I didn't have to fully subscribe to their philosophy of history, which seemed too eschatological for my taste. I certainly didn't need to call myself a Marxist, which felt far too identifying for my taste, and I didn't need to agree with everything or be part of a party, being perhaps more Nietzschean than Leninist. But for a long time, it seemed to me that our history was that of a constant struggle between a dominant class and a dominated class. Marx and Engels in their day spoke of a simple formulation of class antagonisms in the Manifesto. Society, they write, is more and more split up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Now, this language already sounded dated by the late 1970s. It certainly wasn't adequate back then. By the 1980s, already, the term bourgeoisie was not working. It did not actually adequately capture the members of the upper financial echelons, the CEOs, Wall Street, the Hamptons, the country club life, in short, what we would call today the 1% or the 0.1%. As for the proletariat, by the turn of the 1980s, it was no longer clear what the term meant or whether it was even appropriate. It was a placeholder for the poor, the dominated, for that other class, the marginalized, some workers but not all, and of course, for the damned of the earth. Already in 1960, Fanon had confronted the idea of the proletariat with the wretched of the earth, les damnés de la terre, a whole other class of people. But whatever the case may have been, whether I used a more contemporary post-colonial language or more refined terms, I still subscribe to the idea of a constant confrontation between two social classes, at least in the 1980s. The feminist, gay, queer, and trans revolutions, black studies in the United States, abolitionism, all these social and intellectual movements transformed the idea of class struggles, of course, but I always managed to fit them roughly into a certain binary. between the dominant and the dominated, between the unjust and the just. Whether it was historically dominated women versus dominant men, or African Americans versus whites, whether it was historically dominated queer people versus historically dominant straight people, and so on, I was always in the grip of a certain binary struggle between dominant and dominated. Of course, intersectionality showed cuts and further fragmentation and important distinctions. Afro-pessimism and anti-blackness theories showed internal hierarchies that are elided if we view the world simply through the prism of white supremacy, white versus non-white. To invert the prism and look at the world through anti-blackness showed a lot more hierarchy within groups that were non-white, as did subaltern studies. All of these differentiations were complex, always complex, but all the same, I still had the impression that the important divide was between those who dominate and those who are dominated. In my many years editing the work of Michel Foucault, Theories and Penal Institutions, La Société Punitive, Surveiller et Punir, Discipline and Punish, those many years had convinced me, of course, that power relations were not as simple as a struggle between two classes. Foucault made a compelling argument that we needed to reject a reductionist model of class struggle. As he argued in La Société Punitive, the formula that a particular class has power may be a strategically valid formula, but it can't be useful for historical analysis or theoretical analysis. The schema of power as appropriation is just too simple. The schema of power localized in state apparatuses is too simple as well. Power subordinated to a mode of production, that's too simple. The schema of ideology is too simple as well. Yes, power relations were more complicated. We had to think of them through the matrix of civil war. And as far as civil war was concerned, Foucault didn't reduce the model of conflict to opposing camps, although this is what we often think of when we think of a civil war, for example, in the context of the American Civil War. But Foucault didn't give many illustrations of how he thought about civil war, but I would think of it through the Spanish Civil War, right, where the Republicans and the Communists, influenced by the Soviet Union, took on the POUM and the anarchists and the Trotskyists, where there were internal wars within the camps. That's the idea of complex civil wars that Foucault had in mind. And yet it always seemed to me that, roughly speaking, in the end, in fine, there were always the dominant and the dominated. Whether you define them differently as proletarian, transgender, queer, colonized, at the end of the day there was always a struggle between those who dominated and those who are dominated. Today, though, I'm no longer convinced. Perhaps the real problem today, or perhaps in history as well, is quite different. The fundamental social struggle, perhaps, is not between those who dominate and those who are dominated, but rather between those who have an appetite to dominate, a taste for domination, a desire or will to dominate, and those who have an aspiration or a desire for non-dominance, those who seek forms of cooperation. The former, those who seek to dominate or to be dominated, are content living in a world of domination. But they're not limited to the dominant class. In every class, in every group, they can be found, even among enslaved persons, even among, for Marx, the plebeians, among the serfs, among the oppressed. It's perhaps for this reason that in the American antebellum South, for example, some enslaved people became overseers and drivers, and they supervised and disciplined other enslaved people. It is perhaps why there were capos in concentration camps, or people of immigrant origin who oppose immigration. The taste for domination is not limited to the dominant class. And likewise, the appetite or taste for solidarity is not limited to the dominated. So we need to rethink the struggles at the heart of a society. And this is not a question that can be easily resolved with a theory of ideology or of false consciousness. Those who have a taste for domination but find themselves in a precarious and dominated position are not simply fooled by an ideology, nor do they simply have a false consciousness. It's not simply the case that they are going against their true interests. The problem here is that we tend to define interests far too narrowly. We do not take sufficient account of affects, emotions, identity, and forms of recognition. Today, for example, an automobile worker in Michigan may be pro-Trump for reasons of perceived patriotism, or masculinity, or America first, for example, whether or not it helps him in his material conditions. Deleuze and Guattari said it well in Anti-Oedipus, in that discussion of William Reich, right? The Nazi regime didn't impose itself on the German masses. They wanted it and desired it. They preferred those forms of domination. So it's not possible to say simply that those who have an appetite for domination, but are in fact dominated today, have a false consciousness. There may be myriad effective reasons that draw people to forms of domination. And vice versa. It's not possible to say simply that those who have an appetite for cooperation, but are in fact in the dominant class, have a false consciousness. Authoritarian figures are not just elected or put in power by the dominant class, by the 1%. They are given power by a far greater percentage of the population that leans towards a society of domination. If this is correct, then we need to rethink class struggles and imagine ways to convince people of the value and attraction of solidarity. We need to find ways to nurture the taste for cooperation. All right, with that, I think we have a good introduction to Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, and I welcome you to the seminar and hope you enjoy the conversation with Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser. Welcome to Marx 6:13.